The morning of Alina Voss's wedding began with rain. Not the soft kind that England sometimes offers as a gentle greeting, the kind that soaks through wool coats and turns garden paths into small rivers, the kind that arrives with its mind made up. Alina stood at the window of the guest chamber in Windmere Hall, watching it fall across the gray lawns, and told herself it meant nothing. Rain on a wedding day was just weather. It was not an omen. She was not the sort of woman who believed in omens. She was the sort of woman who believed in facts, and the facts were these. She was 22 years old, the second daughter of Sir George Voss, a baronet whose land in Dorset had been quietly shrinking for 30 years. She had a modest education, a decent face, and no fortune to speak of. She had been courted, if it could be called that, by Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Windermere, over the course of 3 visits and 4 letters, all of them polite and none of them warm. And today, before the sun moved past noon, she would become his wife. Her mother had called it a miracle. Alina had called it an arrangement. Now, standing in borrowed candlelight while her mother's lady's maid dressed her hair, Alina watched the rain and kept her thoughts to herself. She had learned early that opinions in her family were a luxury that daughters could not quite afford. The ceremony was held in the private chapel attached to the hall, small, stone, cold even in summer, which this morning was not. Alina walked down the short aisle on her father's arm and did not look at the guests watching from the pews. She looked at Edmund. He stood at the front in a coat so dark it seemed to absorb the candlelight, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture as straight as a man who had been trained from childhood to stand correctly in rooms. He was tall. He had the kind of face that was arranged well, strong jaw, dark eyes, a mouth that could be generous if it chose to be. She had thought, when she first met him, that his eyes were the most interesting thing about him. They were gray and very direct, and gave the impression of a man who was always calculating something. She had not been wrong about that. He did not smile when she reached him. He gave her a brief nod, the way one professional might acknowledge another at the start of a business meeting. She nodded back. Her father placed her hand in Edmund's and stepped away. The minister began. Alina spoke her vows clearly. She had decided she would mean them, even if everything else about this day felt uncertain. She meant the part about faithfulness. She meant the part about honor. She meant the part about staying, even when staying was difficult. Edmund's voice was even and low. He did not stumble over a single word. He said everything he was supposed to say, and not one thing more. When the minister pronounced them married, Edmund turned to her. For a moment, just a moment, something moved behind his gray eyes, something that almost looked like regret. But it was gone before she could be certain she had seen it. And then there were people offering congratulations, and her mother was already crying. And the moment passed the way most honest moments do, unacknowledged and without ceremony. The wedding breakfast was held in the great dining room. Long table, silver candlesticks, flowers that must have cost more than her father earned in a month. Alina sat beside her husband and ate very little and smiled when she was expected to smile. Edmund spoke to the guests with the ease of a man entirely at home in formal rooms, which of course he was. He had grown up in this house. He knew every corner of it. Alina did not yet know where anything was. She thought about that as she smiled at a cousin of Edmund's whose name she had already forgotten. She was in a house she did not know, in a county she had visited twice, sitting beside a man she had spoken to perhaps 16 times in her life. She was not afraid. She was something more complicated than afraid. She was paying very close attention to everything. Edmund's younger brother, George, sat 3 seats down and caught her eye twice during the meal. He was thinner than Edmund, lighter in coloring and manner, and he smiled at her both times with a warmth that was entirely genuine. She liked him immediately. She filed this away. George is kind. George she could speak to when she did not know how to speak to Edmund. The afternoon moved slowly. Guests drifted between rooms. The rain had stopped by mid-afternoon and weak sunlight found its way through the tall windows. Alina was handed from guest to guest, introduced and reintroduced, asked the same 6 questions repeatedly. She answered all of them correctly. By evening, she was tired in the particular way that comes not from physical effort, but from the sustained performance of ease. A dinner, more candles, music from a pianist in the corner of the room. Edmund was present and attentive and said almost nothing to her directly, though he stood near enough that she could feel the warmth of him. She tried once, only once, to start a real conversation. She asked him what he liked best about Windmere Hall. He looked at her as though the question surprised him. Then he said, "The library," and returned his attention to the man on his other side. She resolved to find the library as soon as she could. When the guests finally began to leave, Alina felt the change in the house the way you feel a storm coming, a shift in pressure, a new kind of quiet settling over the rooms. The servants moved efficiently, clearing things, withdrawing. Her mother embraced her at the entrance hall for a long time and whispered, "Be good, my darling," which was the most useful piece of advice she had to offer. Alina did not say what she was thinking, which was that she had always been good, and that had never been enough on its own. Her father shook her hand, the way he might with a colleague. She understood what he meant by it. It was the only way he knew how to say that he thought she had done well. She stood in the entrance hall alone after they left. The house was very quiet. A footman appeared and told her that her Grace's rooms were prepared. She followed him up the wide staircase, down a corridor she had been shown once on a tour, and into a set of rooms that were large and perfectly appointed and smelled faintly of polish and something floral she could not identify. The footman withdrew. Her lady's maid, a woman named Polly who had been assigned to her as part of the household arrangements, helped her out of her wedding dress and into a dressing gown, and then Polly too left, pulling the door of the inner room closed behind her. Alina sat at the dressing table. The mirror showed her a woman who looked composed, which was not quite the same as a woman who was composed. She unclipped the pearl earrings she had borrowed from her mother and set them down and looked at herself for a while in the silence. She was a duchess. It still did not feel like anything in particular. She was still sitting there, her hair half undone, when she heard the outer door of her rooms open. She turned. Edmund stood in the doorway between the outer sitting room and the inner room. He was still dressed. He had a folded piece of paper in his hand. She watched his face. He was looking at the paper, not at her. His expression was the particular kind of blank that does not happen naturally. It was blank the way a surface is blank after someone has wiped it clean. "I need to speak with you," he said. His voice was steady. That steadiness was, she would later understand, the most frightening thing about the moment. Men who are about to be unkind often shout, or pace, or show you the emotion before the damage. Edmund showed her nothing. He came into the room and stood a few feet from her. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she had the feeling of being assessed, not as a person, as a problem. "I received a letter this afternoon," he said, "during dinner." She waited. "It concerns your father," he paused, "and Lord Carver." She did not move. "What about Lord Carver?" "You know him." "I know of him. My father spoke of him occasionally. They had some business dealings years ago. I was young." Edmund's jaw tightened. "The letter states that your father made an agreement with Carver some years ago regarding your marriage, that Carver directed your father to bring the match to my attention, that the purpose of this marriage, from your father's side, was to transfer a debt Carver holds against him, by placing a member of his family close enough to the Ashford estate to be of use." Alina stared at him. She heard every word. She understood what each one meant. What she could not understand in those first seconds was that she was actually sitting in a bedroom on her wedding night, listening to her husband read an accusation from a letter written by a man she had met perhaps once, at a garden party, when she was 15. "That is not true," she said. Edmund looked at her. His expression did not change. "I don't know anything about an agreement between my father and Lord Carver," she said. "I was not party to any such arrangement. I did not know your family existed until my father brought the subject of you to me 18 months ago. The letter is specific, Edmund said. Letters can say anything, Elinor said. Her voice was steady because she made it steady. Someone wrote that letter. It does not mean what it says is true. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at the paper again. She watched the angle of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the posture of a man who had already made a decision and was now delivering it, not weighing it. I cannot, he said carefully, in good conscience keep you in this house while this matter is unresolved. The room was very still. You are asking me to leave, she said. He did not answer immediately. On our wedding night, she said. There is an estate in Northumberland, Harwick. It is modest but comfortable. You will have a full household, an allowance. Edmund? She said his name for the first time without a title before it, just his name, flat and direct. He stopped. I am telling you that I did not do this. I am telling you that I do not know anything about what was written in that letter. I am your wife. We were married 4 hours ago, and you are sending me away because of a piece of paper. I am sending you away until I can determine the truth of the matter. You could determine the truth by speaking to me, she said, by asking questions, by investigating Lord Carver, who you will find, if you bother to look, has every reason to want to damage my family and now, by extension, yours. He said nothing. She looked at him for a long moment. She memorized his face, the clean lines of it, the gray eyes, the mouth that could be generous if it chose to be. She had thought for a small hopeful window of time that it might choose to be. When would you have me go? She asked. Tomorrow morning, he said, early, before the remaining guests are awake. Before anyone sees, she understood. He wanted it done quietly. She turned back to the dressing table. Then I will be ready, she said. There was a pause behind her. She did not turn around. After a long moment, she heard his footsteps cross the floor and the outer door open and close. She sat in the silence of the room. She did not cry, not yet. She sat very still and breathed and kept her eyes on her own reflection and made herself think clearly, the way she had taught herself to think when she was small and her father was in a difficult mood and the house required managing. One thing at a time. What needs doing first? What needed doing first was packing. She rose from the dressing table and went to find Polly. The carriage was brought around before first light. The air smelled of wet earth and new cold, the way autumn mornings smell in the north even when you haven't reached the north yet. Elinor descended the front steps of Windmere Hall in a traveling dress and a wool cloak, with 2 trunks behind her, and Polly following in a state of quiet distress that she was doing her best to hide. Edmund stood at the top of the steps. He had come to see her off. She did not know what to make of that, whether it was guilt or habit or the simple compulsion of a man who felt that decency required witnessing what he had arranged. She paused at the bottom of the steps and looked up at him. I am innocent, she said, quietly, clearly. I want you to hear me say it one more time before I leave so that if you do eventually discover the truth, you will remember that I told it to you at the beginning. His face was unreadable. Take care of yourself, she said, because she could not think of anything else and she would not beg. She got into the carriage. The door closed. The horses moved. She looked straight ahead and did not look back at the hall and did not allow herself to think about the library she had never found, the house she had not yet learned, the husband she had barely begun to know. She thought instead about what she had, which was, she catalogued carefully, herself, her intelligence, her willingness to work, and a very long ride to Northumberland. It would have to be enough. The carriage rolled forward through the gates and out onto the road, and Elinor Voss, Elinor Ashford, whether he wanted her to be or not, kept her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and let the distance grow. Behind her, the candles in Windmere Hall were still burning. She did not look back. 3 days it took to cry, after all. Not the whole 3 days, she managed perfectly well for the first two, eating the meals the coachman arranged at coaching inns, speaking to Polly, watching the landscape change from the soft rolling green of the south to the harder, wider country of the north, where the hills had edges and the sky was a different shade of pale. But on the third evening, when the carriage finally turned down the long lane toward Harwick, and she saw it for the first time, a house that was not grand, whose windows were dark and whose garden had been left too long without attention, something in her chest went wrong. It happened quietly. No warning. She sat in the dark of the carriage with her hands in her lap, and she cried for a long time while Polly held one of them and didn't say a word, because Polly, whatever her other qualities, understood when silence was the kinder thing. And then Alina dried her face, and got out of the carriage, and went inside to see what she had been given and what she could make of it. She was 22 years old. She had been a wife for exactly 4 hours. She had, she decided, no plans to remain broken about it. The letter arrived from Northumberland in the handwriting of Lord Carver's solicitor, and Edmund Ashford read it standing at his desk at 7 in the morning, still in his riding clothes, his coat damp from the early ride he had taken because he had not been able to sleep. He had not been sleeping well since the morning the carriage left. That was 3 weeks ago, and 3 weeks was, he had decided, enough time for the sharp and uncomfortable feeling in his chest to have dulled itself down to something manageable. It had not. He put the letter from Carver's solicitor down on the desk and went to the window and looked out at the grounds of Windmere Hall, which were still and gray in the November morning, and tried to think clearly. The letter was not what he expected. He had expected, in an unexamined way, to feel relief when the matter of Carver began to resolve itself. He had expected Carver to behave the way people of that type behaved, to push, to demand, to make the debt explicit now that Edmund had cooperated with the first part of his scheme by removing Alina from the estate. Instead, Carver's solicitor wrote that Lord Carver wished to offer his congratulations on the marriage and his warm regards to the Duke and the Duchess, and that he had no further matters to raise at this time. Edmund read this 3 times. He sat down at the desk. He read it again. No further matters to raise, as though there had been a matter and it was now settled and Carver was satisfied. Edmund set the letter down. He pressed the heels of his hands against the edge of the desk and thought about what that meant. If the letter Carver had sent on the wedding night had been designed to make Edmund act in a particular way, and it clearly had, because Edmund had acted in exactly the particular way the letter intended, then the question was, what was Carver's purpose? If the intent had been to damage Alina's family by destroying the marriage, Carver would not be sending warm regards. If the intent had been to use Alina as a lever against Edmund, the lever had been removed. Unless the point had never been Alina at all. Unless the point had been Edmund himself, to demonstrate that the Duke of Windermere could be made to act rashly and without evidence, that his pride and his suspicion were tools that could be used against him, that a single letter on a single well-chosen evening could be deployed to dismantle whatever threat Edmund might represent. Edmund stood up from the desk. He walked to the window again. He thought about a specific thing, that when Alina had said, "I am innocent," he had believed her. He had believed her in the moment she said it, something in her voice, the flat and steady quality of it, the absence of performance. He had believed her and sent her away anyway. Because he had decided that the risk was too large, and the evidence was too specific, and he could not afford to be wrong. He had been very, very wrong. He called for his secretary. "I need information about Lord Carver," he said, when the young man appeared. "Everything. Every debt, every dealing, every enemy he's made in the last 20 years. I want a full account. Hire investigators if you must." His secretary, a thin, careful man named Morris, wrote this down without expression. "Is there a timeline?" "As quickly as possible," Edmund said. Morris left. Edmund turned back to the desk and looked at the letter from Carver's solicitor. He thought about Alina getting into the carriage. He thought about what she had said. He thought about the fact that she had said, "I want you to hear me say it one more time before I leave," meaning she had said it before that. She had said it and he had not listened. He had processed it as a thing to be noted and set aside. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the drawer and uncapped his pen, and then sat for several minutes without writing anything. He did not write to Alina. He did not know yet what he would say. He knew only that he needed to know more before he said anything, because words, once sent, could not be unsent, and he had already done enough damage with words in one night to last a marriage several lifetimes. Instead, he wrote to his brother George, who was in London for the season and who had taken the news of Alina's departure with a controlled silence that Edmund had not mistaken for agreement. George had said, very quietly, "Are you certain?" And Edmund had said yes. And George had not argued further, but he had looked at Edmund the way younger brothers sometimes look at older ones, with that particular combination of respect and deep, tired disappointment. The letter to George was short. It said only, "I may have made an error. I am looking into it. When you have time, I would value your opinion on the Carver matter." He sealed it, handed it to Morris on the way out. Then he went to the stables, because riding was the only thing that cleared his head reliably, and his head very much needed clearing. The investigations came back in pieces over the following weeks. The picture they assembled was not comfortable to look at. Lord Carver, Frederick Carver, 3rd Baron, with estates in Herefordshire and debts considerably larger than his estates, had been in a long and particular dispute with Edmund's father, the late Duke, over a land matter that had been adjudicated against Carver some 15 years prior. The late Duke had won. Carver had lost something he considered valuable, and he had the kind of personality that kept grievances warm and ready. When the late Duke died, Carver had turned his attention to Edmund. Edmund was younger and newer, and Carver had apparently calculated, more susceptible to a well-timed piece of information. The letter on the wedding night had been Carver's instrument. The claim that Alina's father had conspired with Carver was, as best Edmund's investigators could determine, fabricated. Sir George Voss had borrowed money from Carver once, years ago, and repaid it. That was the entirety of their connection. There was no scheme. There was no arrangement. There was a frightened baronet who owed nothing, and a daughter who had done nothing, and a letter designed to make Edmund do something he could not undo. Edmund read the investigator's report at his desk on a cold December morning, and sat with it for a long time. He was not a man given to public displays of feeling. He had been trained against them from early childhood. A duke did not show weakness, which was the category under which his father had filed most human emotions. But sitting alone at his desk with the report in his hands, Edmund allowed himself to feel what he felt, which was not grief exactly, and not anger exactly, but something that combined the weight of both. He had done this, not Carver alone. Carver had given him the letter. Edmund had made the choice. He could have asked Alina what she knew. He could have investigated before acting. He could have said, "This letter has arrived and I want to understand it," said it to her, the woman who was his wife, who was standing 5 feet away, who had looked him in the eye and said she knew nothing of it. He had not done any of those things. He had weighed the evidence and the risk and the cost and made a calculation, and the thing he had failed to factor into the calculation, the thing that had not been given any weight at all, was Alina herself. What she was, what her word was worth, whether she deserved to be believed. He folded the report, set it in the desk drawer, locked it. Then he sent for Morris. "I want to know the state of Harwick," he said. "The estate in Northumberland. I want a full report on how it's being managed." Morris had been Edmund's secretary for 4 years, and had developed the necessary skill of receiving instructions without any visible reaction. "I'll arrange for one," he said. "I also want to know how the Duchess is." Edmund said this carefully, as though the word might break if he held it wrong. Morris wrote it down. How detailed a report? As much as can be learned without sending someone who will seem like a spy, Edmund said. Understood. Morris left. Edmund got up from his desk and went to the window that looked south, though Northumberland was north and Harwick was north, and he was looking in entirely the wrong direction. He stood there for a while, looking at the grounds of Windmere Hall. His sister Margox arrived 2 days later from Bath. He had not summoned her. She had heard, through the kind of family network that cannot be shut off regardless of how private you intend to be, that something was wrong. She arrived in the early afternoon in a carriage that she drove too fast because she always did, and she appeared in his study still wearing her traveling coat, with the brisk and unapologetic energy of a woman who had decided to involve herself in something and was not going to pretend otherwise. "Tell me," she said without preamble. Edmund told her all of it. She listened without interrupting, which was rare for Margox, who had opinions the way other people have, whether constantly, in various forms, whether you wanted them or not. She sat across from him and listened to the whole account: the letter, the decision, Aliner's departure, the investigation. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You sent a girl away on her wedding night," she said. "I've already reached that conclusion myself," Edmund said. "Based on a letter from a man, you should have investigated before you acted." "Yes." Without asking her a single serious question. "I asked." "You informed her," Margox said. "That is not the same as asking." Edmund said nothing. He had noticed that when Margox was right, she had a way of being right in the specific, so that each point landed separately and cleanly, like items being set down on a table. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm not certain yet," he said. Margox looked at him with the particular look of a younger sister who has spent a lifetime watching her older brother make things more complicated than they needed to be. It was a look that mixed exasperation with affection in roughly equal parts. "Edmund," she said, "you're going to have to go north." "I know." "Not in 6 months. Not after more reports and more investigations." "I know." "You're going to have to go, and you're going to have to say what you did without decorating it, or explaining it, or wrapping it in legal language. And you're going to have to accept whatever she says in return." He looked at her. "That's not a simple thing you're describing." "No," Margox said pleasantly, "it is not. But you are the one who made it complicated, and so you are the one who has to go through the complicated part to get out of it." She stood and adjusted her coat. "I'm going to wash off the road. Have someone show me to a room." "You're staying?" "Yes," she said. "I have opinions on how to write letters, and I expect you'll need help with the first one." "I don't need help writing letters." She paused at the door and looked back at him. "Edmund, you sent your wife away on your wedding night. You definitely need help writing letters." She left. He stood at the window for a long time after. In Northumberland, the report from Harwick arrived on Edmund's desk 3 weeks later. It was written by one of Morris's contacts, a land agent in the area who had done a careful and discreet assessment. Edmund read it at his desk one morning in January with snow on the ground outside and a fire going in the grate, and it was not the report he expected. The estate, the report said, was in significantly better order than it had been when the Duchess arrived. Edmund read that sentence again. The report went on. The tenants had been met with individually. Several disputes that had been unresolved for years had been addressed. A section of wall on the northern boundary that had been crumbling since the previous steward's tenure had been repaired. The kitchen garden had been expanded. The household accounts, which had been kept loosely under the previous arrangement, were now kept in good order in a ledger that the agent described as meticulous. Edmund sat back in his chair. There was a brief personal note at the end of the report, which the agent had perhaps added as an afterthought. It said only that the Duchess appeared to be held in high regard by the household staff and by the tenants, that she was seen regularly on the estate grounds, and that the house, which had been quiet and underused before her arrival, now had a different quality about it. The agent hadn't been sure how to describe it more precisely. He had written the words "seems lived in" and underlined them lightly, as though aware this was not the most official language but had decided it was the most accurate. Edmund read the report 3 times. Then he put it in the drawer with the investigator's report about Carver, and he locked the drawer, and he went to find his sister, who was in the library reading, and who looked up at him over the edge of her book with an expression that said she had been expecting him. "I need to write a letter," he said. "I know," said Margox. "She won't want to read it." "Probably not. Write it anyway." He pulled a chair up to the library table and asked for paper, and Margox put her book down and folded her hands on the table, and for the better part of an afternoon they argued about every sentence and rewrote most of them and argued again. And it was the most useful thing Edmund had done since the morning Alina had stepped into the carriage and been carried north. He sent the letter. He received no reply. He sent another 3 weeks later. Still nothing. He was not, he told himself, surprised. He had not expected this to be easy. He had told Margox he had not expected it to be easy, and Margox had said, good, because easy would mean it didn't matter, and if it didn't matter to Alina, Edmund's life was going to be considerably simpler and considerably worse. He sat with that for a long time. He had married a woman he barely knew. That was not unusual for men of his position. Marriages were arrangements, most of them, transactions between families with titles on one side and money on the other, and whatever personal feeling developed afterward was a private matter and not the point. He had known that going in. He had accepted it. What he had not anticipated, what no one had told him to anticipate, because no one had thought it worth mentioning, was that the woman herself might be someone worth knowing. He had spent exactly 4 hours married to Alina Voss before making it impossible to know her, and in those 4 hours what he had learned was this: she stood in a chapel in the rain without shaking. She looked at him with clear eyes and asked him a real question. She said his name without his title and looked at him like a person, which was not as common an experience as it should have been. When he told her she had to leave, she did not shout or plead. She told him the truth, and then asked what time the carriage would come. He had thought about that quality of hers quite a lot over the preceding months. He wrote a 3rd letter, this one shorter. He told her only that he had completed his investigation, that he understood the truth of what had happened, that the fault was his and entirely his, that he did not expect her to forgive him quickly or at all, that he would write again regardless. He sent it. 3 weeks later, a single folded paper arrived from Northumberland. His name on the outside in a hand he did not yet know well, though he had begun to recognize it from the brief administrative notes she had sent through Morris. He opened it. There were 4 words. "I know," she had written, "you should." He read it in his study alone, and he understood that it was not a forgiveness or a welcome. It was something else, an acknowledgment that he existed and had spoken, and that she had received it. It was, he thought, more than he deserved. He put the letter in the drawer with the others. He did not lock it this time. He began to plan. Alina learned how to manage an estate in winter. This was not something anyone had taught her, because no one had expected her to need it. The education of a baronet's daughter in England in the early 19th century was designed to produce a woman who could manage a household, menus, staff, social calendars, the correct way to receive a guest and dismiss a tradesman. It was not designed to produce a woman who could negotiate a repair contract with a stone mason, or arbitrate a boundary dispute between 2 tenant farmers who had hated each other for 11 years, or renegotiate the terms of a grain supply arrangement that had been quietly disadvantaging the estate for the better part of a decade. Alina learned to do all of these things by doing them. The first problem was the wall. It had been crumbling along the northern edge of the Harwick estate since before Alina arrived, and the tenants on both sides of it had opinions about who was responsible for fixing it and very little interest in paying for it themselves. Alina walked the length of it on her fourth morning in Northumberland, in boots she had borrowed from the housekeeper, because she had not thought to bring sensible outdoor shoes, with frost on the grass and her breath clouding in the cold air. She looked at the wall. She looked at the fields on either side of it. She went back to the house and found the estate accounts and read them carefully for the better part of an afternoon. The accounts were a mess. They were not dishonestly kept, but they were carelessly kept, figures entered without explanation, expenditures without dates, a general arrangement that suggested the previous steward had been managing by memory and instinct and trust that everything would balance out in the end. Alina found 3 separate agreements with local suppliers that had terms less favorable than they should have been, and a lease arrangement with a farmer named Hadley that had not been reviewed in 15 years and was, she calculated, undercharging him by almost 40% of the current market rate. She did not begin there. She began by simply introducing herself to the staff, which took a full day. There were fewer people than there should have been for an estate this size, and the ones who were there had the careful, waiting quality of people who had grown accustomed to being overlooked. The housekeeper, Mrs. Grant, was a woman in her 60s with a competent face, and a reserve that Alina recognized immediately as self-protection, the professional distance of someone who had worked under several arrangements and had learned not to invest too much in any particular one. Alina spent an hour with Mrs. Grant going over the house, listening more than speaking, asking questions that were genuine rather than performative. By the end of the hour, Mrs. Grant's reserve had not disappeared, but it had shifted. Something in it had decided to wait and see, which was more than Alina had hoped for on the first day. Then she met the tenants. She arranged for them to come to the house over the course of 2 weeks, one family at a time, and she sat with them in the estate's working room, not the formal parlor, not behind a wide desk designed to create distance, and she listened to what they had to say. There was a great deal to say. 11 years of unresolved boundary disputes, a drainage problem in the South Field that had been complained about repeatedly and never addressed, a concern about the quality of the seed arrangement through the estate's supplier, which one farmer, a broad-shouldered, direct-speaking man named Hadley, who turned out to be the same Hadley whose lease was 15 years old, had been raising formally for 2 years with no response. Alina listened to all of it. She wrote it down. She did not make promises she could not keep. She said, "I understand, and I'll look into that, and let me see what the records show," and she meant every one of those things. By Christmas, which she spent quietly, with Polly and Mrs. Grant and a small gathering of household staff, she had resolved the drainage issue, begun negotiations on the seed supply, reviewed and renegotiated 3 of the supplier agreements, and arranged for the wall to be repaired using estate funds and a modest contribution from both tenant families, which she had achieved by sitting them down together and pointing out that the cost of continued arguing was going to exceed the cost of simply fixing the thing. She found this work satisfying in a way that surprised her. She had grown up managing the small complications of her family's diminishing household, the quiet arithmetic of making things work with not quite enough, the skill of making people feel attended to even when you could not give them everything they needed. Those skills, it turned out, translated. Polly worried about her. Alina could see it in the way Polly watched her at breakfast and in the slight hesitation before she said good night, the pause of someone checking that the person in front of them was actually all right. "I'm fine," Alina told her, on an evening in December when the fire was going and the snow was beginning outside and Polly had paused one time too many. "You work very hard," Polly said. "There's a great deal to do. You could rest." "I rest when I sleep." Polly looked at her with the expression of someone who wanted to say several things and was choosing the most diplomatic. "Do you miss Windmere?" she asked. Alina considered the question honestly. "I miss what I thought it might be," she said after a moment. "The actual place I barely knew. The library was meant to be good." She picked up her book. "Though I expect this library will do." Polly smiled. "It has some very good ones." "It does," Alina said. "Go to bed, Polly, you look exhausted." Polly went to bed. Alina read until midnight and then sat by the dying fire for a while, not reading and not thinking about anything in particular, just being in the house, feeling its quality around her. The stone walls and the old wood and the cold that came through the windows even with the curtains drawn. There was a particular kind of nighttime silence in Northumberland that was different from anything she had known before, a silence that had weight and texture, that came from miles of moor and empty sky pressing down around the house. She had not expected to like it, but she did. Spring arrived and brought with it a letter from a solicitor in London, requesting her signature on some estate transfer documentation. She read it twice and set it aside, and then, 3 days later, sent a one-line reply that was not quite rude but was absolutely clear. She was not a financial instrument and would not be managed as one. She did not hear back. She told no one about it except Mrs. Grant, to whom she said only that there had been some London business that was being handled. Mrs. Grant nodded and asked if her Grace would like the rosemary in the kitchen garden extended to the south wall now that the frost was finished. "Yes," Alina said, "and add thyme if there's room. The cook said she could use more." She went back to the accounts. In April, a man named Captain Arthur Dalton appeared at the gate asking for direction to the next village, and ended up at her door, because one of the tenant children had directed him to the house in the mistaken belief that the Duchess knew everything and could help with all problems, which was not entirely inaccurate. He was polite. He was traveling through the county on leave from his regiment. He was from a family she vaguely recognized, Daltons of Westmoreland, minor gentry, no particular scandal attached to the name. He had a straightforward quality about him, the manner of a man who had spent time in military structures and had developed the useful skill of being direct without being rude. He was perhaps 30. He had brown eyes and an easy way of speaking to people that Alina immediately recognized as genuine rather than performed. She offered him tea because she was in a good mood, and the day was fine. He stayed for an hour. He came back the following Tuesday. Not to ask for directions this time. He said he had been passing through the area again, which was plausible given that his regiment's winter quarters were some distance north, and which Alina suspected was not entirely accurate but chose not to examine too closely. He was good company. He had been to interesting places and talked about them without showing off. He had opinions on books, which was rare. He was interested in how the estate worked in a way that was curious rather than interrogating. He asked questions the way someone asks questions when they actually want to know the answers. Alina did not let herself think of him as anything other than a neighbor and a source of pleasant conversation. She was extremely careful about this. She had a husband who was somewhere in the south who had sent her here, and whatever she thought of that situation, and she thought quite a lot about it, in the quiet hours, in the way of someone who has filed something important and cannot stop returning to the file, it was the situation. But she was also 23 years old and lonely in ways she had not entirely admitted to herself, and Arthur Dalton made her laugh, and laughter was, she discovered, something she had been missing more than she had realized. He became a regular feature of Tuesdays through the spring and into summer. Sometimes he brought things, a book he thought she might enjoy, a jar of honey from a farm he had passed, once an extremely impractical bunch of wildflowers that he presented with the sheepish air of a man who had picked them on impulse and then had to carry them for 2 miles. She put the wildflowers in the working room, where she kept the accounts, because that was the room she spent the most time in. Polly noticed. Polly noticed everything and said nothing, because she was Polly and her skill was the intelligent management of silence. Elinor thought about Edmund occasionally, more than occasionally in truth. She thought about him the way you think about an unfinished argument, returning to it, rerunning the sequence of it, wondering if anything about it could have gone differently. She thought about the gray eyes and the library and the 4 hours of being his wife. She thought about the letter she had written him in response to his third attempt, the 4 words, and she thought about whether she had done the right thing in writing even that much. She thought she had. She thought you should always say the truth, even when the truth was not kind. She wondered sometimes what he had done when he received it. She had not written again. Nor had he, after those 3 letters, though Morris, his secretary, sent occasional administrative notes about the estate that were properly addressed to her, and which she dealt with efficiently and returned without personal comment. It was, she told herself, a system. It was workable. It was not. She told herself honestly at midnight in the firelit sitting room, what she had imagined when she stood in that cold chapel and said her vows and meant them. But she had not become a woman who required things to be what she had imagined. She had become a woman who managed what was real and made it as good as it could be. The estate by the end of summer was considerably more than it had been when she arrived. The accounts were in order. The tenants were largely at peace, or at least performing peace in her presence, which was a meaningful improvement. The kitchen garden was flourishing. Hadley had agreed to a revised lease and had shaken her hand at the signing with the careful respect of a man who had been surprised by her and was not sure how to show it except through this small formal gesture. She stood at the edge of the north field on a September afternoon and looked at the repaired wall and the green country rolling away beyond it and felt, for the first time since the carriage had turned down this lane nearly a year ago, something that she chose to identify as contentment, not happiness. Contentment was more useful. Contentment was what you built when happiness was not available in its pure form, and it was, in her experience, considerably more durable. She walked back to the house in the late afternoon light. In the kitchen, someone was baking bread. In the sitting room, Polly was doing needlework. Mrs. Grant was in the garden with the kitchen girl, discussing something about the herb beds with the focused energy of 2 people who cared deeply about herbs. The house smelled of bread in autumn and wood smoke. Elinor went to the working room and sat at the desk and looked at the day's correspondence. There was a note from Hadley about a fence repair, a letter from a supplier in the nearest town regarding winter provisions, a pamphlet that Arthur Dalton had left on Tuesday, which was about agricultural improvements and which she had been meaning to read. She picked up Hadley's note and began to write back. She was here, the house was hers, the work was hers. Whatever came next, she was not going to be found unprepared for it. George Ashford died in March of the 2nd year, in his rooms in London, of a fever that arrived quickly and left nothing behind to argue with. Edmund received the news by express courier at 5 in the morning. He was at his desk by 6. He was on his way to London by 8. He rode through it the way he rode through everything difficult efficiently and without visible collapse. He arranged the funeral. He dealt with the estate solicitors. He received the mourners and spoke to each of them in turn and said the correct things in the correct tone. He managed every piece of it. He did not sleep well for 6 weeks. George had been younger by 4 years, which put him at 27 when he died, which was, as a plain fact, not an age at which a person was supposed to stop. He had been thin and bright and had laughed at things easily, which Edmund had always found both admirable and slightly baffling. George had found the world genuinely amusing in ways that Edmund could not quite access, as though they had been given different instruments, and Edmund's happened to be better suited to playing in minor keys. What Edmund had known, and what he had not told George, was that part of his reason for sending Elinor away when Carver's letter arrived had been this. Carver had, in the letter, made an oblique but clear suggestion that his interests in the matter included the Duke's younger brother. Edmund had understood this as a threat. He had acted on it by removing the person Carver had claimed was his instrument, which was Alina, because he had believed that removing her would satisfy whatever Carver wanted. He had been wrong about this on multiple levels. Carver had gotten what he wanted regardless, which was not Alina, but rather the demonstration that Edmund could be made to act badly on short notice. And George had died of a fever that had nothing to do with Carver at all, which removed the last scaffolding from Edmund's original logic and left it standing naked in the open, unsupported by any plausible reading of events. He stood at George's grave on a gray March morning and understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that he had sacrificed a person to protect another person, and had protected no one and sacrificed everything. This was the exact form that being completely wrong took when it completed itself. He did not fall apart. He was not built for falling apart. But he stood at that grave for a long time after everyone else had moved away, and he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done and lost and failed to prevent. And then he nodded once, to no one in particular, and walked back to the carriages. Margox was waiting for him. She had come to London for the funeral. She had not asked unnecessary questions. She was very good in crises, which was a family trait. They were all good in crises. It was afterwards that things came apart. "How are you?" she asked in the carriage back. "I will be fine," he said. She looked at him with the look that meant she knew the difference between being fine and saying it. She did not push. She had learned over 32 years which battles with Edmund were worth fighting and which ones required patience. "I'm going to see her," he said. Not immediately. It came out later after dinner, when the house was quiet and they were sitting in the library in the way that their family had always gathered in libraries at the end of difficult days. In Northumberland. When Margox asked, "I don't know yet, not immediately, but it's been 2 years, it needs to," he stopped, tried again. "It needs to be addressed properly, in person." "Yes," Margox said, "it does." He looked at her. "You have not said I told you so." "I did tell you so," she said. "I told you repeatedly over 2 years in a variety of ways, but you're saying the right thing now and I prefer to encourage that." He almost smiled. "Thank you." "Don't thank me, go north." He did not go immediately. There were things to be done first, George's estate to be settled, certain matters at Windermere that required attention, a speech in the Lords that he had committed to before any of this happened, and that he kept because he had committed to it. He was a man who kept commitments. The irony of this, given the particular commitment he had failed to keep, was not lost on him. He also, in truth, was afraid. He had never been easily afraid. Fear was not a thing he permitted himself in public or in the formal conduct of his life. But privately, sitting at his desk late at night with the report about Harwick and Alina's forward letter in the drawer, Edmund was afraid. He was afraid of what she had built without him. He was afraid that he would go north and find a woman who had become so entirely herself that there was no space left for him anywhere in the picture. Not as a husband, not as a person she could tolerate, not even as a useful acquaintance. He was afraid that her forward reply had not been a door left slightly ajar, but simply the most efficient way of saying, "Received, understood, do not expect more." He was also afraid of the journey itself. Not the physical journey. He had ridden worse roads in worse weather than any road to Northumberland would offer, but the other kind. The one that required arriving somewhere without a strategy, without a prepared position, without knowing the outcome in advance. He was not accustomed to doing things without knowing the outcome in advance. Margox returned to Bath. She had given him what she could and she knew when to leave, which was another quality he valued in her. Before she left, she handed him a sealed letter. "What is this?" he asked. "A letter I wrote to Alina," she said. "About a year ago. I never sent it because I decided it wasn't my place, but you should read it. It might help you understand what you're going to be facing." He opened it after she left. It was long, 3 pages in Margox's quick, legible handwriting, and it was the most honest assessment of Edmund that anyone had ever committed to paper. It said what he was good at and what he was bad at. It said what he had been trained to do and what he had never been taught. It said that he was capable of more than he had demonstrated, but that he required pressure of a particular kind to access it, and that the pressure in question was not criticism or argument, but something more like being believed in by the right person. He read it twice. He folded it and put it with the other letters in the drawer. He understood now that Margox had not been writing to Alina. She had been writing to him, in the form of a letter to Alina, knowing he would read it eventually. That was exactly the kind of sideways approach that his sister favored, getting where she needed to go by not going there directly. He sat at the desk for a long time. Then he pulled a sheet of paper toward him and began to write, not a letter to Alina but a list. He made lists when he needed to think, had done it since childhood. It was the way his mind organized itself, through the physical act of writing things down in order. The list was simple. What he had done on one side, what he intended to do on the other. He did not show anyone the list. He looked at it for a few days and then burned it because the burning was part of the thinking, the acknowledgement that what had happened was known and finished, and could not be undone, and therefore did not require keeping. What could be done was what remained. In the weeks after George's funeral, Edmund threw himself into the running of the estates with a focus that surprised even Morris, who was not easily surprised. He was in his office by 6. He read everything. He had conversations he had been delaying about tenants and improvements, and the management of 3 separate properties that had been quietly declining under arrangements that were more comfortable for the people managing them than for the estate itself. He was not doing this to avoid thinking about Alina. He was doing it because he had a habit, when something was wrong, of putting everything else in order first. It was not efficient. It was not logical. It was something closer to superstition, the private belief that if the visible things were clean and correct, the invisible things might follow. Margox would have called this avoidance. She would have been at least partially right. One morning in May, a full 2 months after the funeral, Morris knocked on the study door and came in with a look of careful neutrality that meant he had information he was uncertain how to deliver. "There's been a letter from a Captain Dalton," Morris said, "from Westmoreland, addressed to you, Your Grace." Edmund looked up from his desk. "I don't know a Captain Dalton." "No," Morris said, and he handed over the letter. Edmund read it. It was brief and direct. Captain Arthur Dalton wrote that he understood he was addressing a situation which was not his place, and which the Duke might reasonably object to his involving himself in. He wrote that he was a friend of the Duchess. He used that word, friend, without the emphasis or edge that would have made it something else, and that he had become aware, through the natural course of conversation over several months, that the Duke had expressed a wish to address the circumstances of the previous 2 years. He wrote that he was not writing to plead anyone's case or to position himself in the matter. He was writing because he thought someone should tell Edmund directly. Alina did not often speak of what had happened, but when she did, it was without anger. This, he wrote, in his experience, was more significant than if she were angry, because anger at least meant she was still arguing with it. The absence of anger meant she had accepted it as a fact of her life and moved forward. He was not, the letter concluded, suggesting Edmund do or not do anything. He simply thought that if Edmund was planning to approach the matter, the right time was now, while she was still in the part of this that had not yet become settled history. Edmund put the letter down. He picked it up again, read it again. He felt, for a complicated moment, something that was not quite gratitude and not quite resentment and not quite admiration, some combination of all 3 that landed as a kind of respect for a man he had never met, who had written to him out of something that appeared to be genuine concern rather than calculation. He thought about what it meant that Dalton had written. He thought about what it meant that Dalton had described himself as a friend and been careful with that word. He thought about Alina accepting the situation as a fact of her life. The thought was not comfortable. It was not meant to be. He found Morris in the outer office. "I'm going north," he said. "Arrange the horses. I'll leave in 2 days." Morris nodded and did not say anything and went to make the arrangements. Edmund went back to his desk and looked at the study around him, the room where his father had sat, and his father before that, the room that smelled of leather and paper, and the particular brand of institutional quiet that accumulated in places where serious men did serious things for a long time. He had sat in this room and managed from it for his entire adult life. He had made choices in it that he could not unmake. He left it, went upstairs, found his traveling clothes. He had stayed in this room long enough. He rode north on a Tuesday. He told no one except Morris the exact day, and Morris because Morris arranged everything. The horses, the route, the inn stops, the letter to the estate in Northumberland saying only that the Duke intended to visit Harwick in the coming week, and that no particular preparation was required. He did not say in the letter that he intended to speak to Alina. He did not say that he intended to explain himself or apologize or ask anything. He did not know yet what he intended precisely, and so he said as little as possible and let the miles decide. He rode alone. He had been offered a groom and had declined. He wanted no company on this particular journey. He had too much to think about in company. Even the silent, professional company of a man a few horse lengths behind would have required some level of performance, some maintenance of the face he showed the world, and he did not have the energy for it. He needed to simply be a man on a horse moving north through England. He left in the gray early morning with the sky beginning to lighten behind the trees and the road empty in both directions. Windermere Hall was behind him in less than an hour. He crossed into the open country of the Midlands by midday and stopped at a coaching inn for a meal he barely tasted. He was back on the road before the hour was out. The landscape changed as he moved north. This was one of the things he had always noticed about England. It did not stay the same for long. You could ride a single day and pass through 3 entirely different countries. The soft, organized fields of the south giving way to something wider and less certain as you moved through the middle counties, and then the north emerging out of it like a different place entirely, with its long skis and its hills with real edges, and its specific quality of light that was brighter and harsher and more honest than what he was accustomed to. He had not been to Northumberland in years. He had arranged for Harwick to be maintained without visiting it. He understood now that this was another version of the same mistake, managing at a distance, keeping the uncomfortable thing at arm's length, trusting reports instead of his own eyes. He stopped for the first night at an inn in Yorkshire. The room was plain and the fire was good, and he sat by it for an hour before sleeping, going over nothing useful, just feeling the fatigue of the road in his shoulders and looking at the fire. He thought briefly about what he was going to say. He arrived at nothing useful and put it aside. He thought briefly about Dalton's letter. He put that aside too. He thought about George for a while, the way he had been thinking about George since March, in fragments, unpredictably, the way grief arrived when it wasn't being supervised. He let himself do it. There was no one to keep it from here. He slept without dreaming, and was on the road again before light. The second day was longer and harder. The road north of York was good for the first 20 miles and then became substantially worse. A storm had come through the previous week and left a section in poor repair. He had to pick his way around it, adding an hour to the journey. He was cold by mid-afternoon, genuinely cold in the way that gets through layers, and he stopped at a farmhouse long enough to warm his hands and let the horse rest, and be given a bowl of soup by a woman who asked no questions, which he appreciated. He reached the moor country in the late afternoon. The clouds were moving fast, and the light was the kind of complicated gold and gray that only happens on high ground in changing weather. He pulled his horse to a walk and looked at it for a moment, the wide, empty reach of it, the shadows moving across it, the total indifference of the landscape to anyone's problems. He had the thought, very clearly, that a leaner had been living in this country for 2 years. He had the further thought that a person who had spent 2 years in this landscape, managing alone, had grown into something that a man on a horse from the south had better not underestimate. He arrived at Harwick on the third afternoon as the sun was beginning to lower. He came down the lane, a longer approach than Windermere, curving through trees, and the house appeared gradually. First the chimney pots, then the upper-story windows, then the full face of it. He stopped his horse at the gate. A gate-post that had not been there 2 years ago stood with a simple iron hook for a lantern. The lantern was not yet lit. The lane beyond was swept. The garden visible on the left was in good order, not the formal arrangement of a house trying to be impressive, but the cared-for practicality of a garden that was actually used. The house was smaller than Windermere, considerably older. The stone was the deep gray of northern buildings that have been standing for 200 years and intend to stand for 200 more. It was not grand. It had not been made grand. But it was, unmistakably and entirely, alive. Lights in the lower windows, smoke from 2 chimneys, a cat on the front step. In the field to the left a man was coming in from the day's work, carrying something across his shoulders, not hurrying. Edmund sat at the gate for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he dismounted and led the horse through. A stable hand came around from the side of the house with the instinctive efficiency of someone who had seen unexpected guests before and knew what to do. Edmund handed over the horse, said his name, said he believed the household was expecting him within the week. The stable hand said yes, they'd had the letter, and he took the horse without further comment. Edmund walked to the front door. He knocked. The door was opened by a young man, a footman, neat and quick, who said that the Duke was expected and asked him to come in. Edmund stepped inside into a hallway that smelled of wood smoke and something baking, and the fresh-cut flowers that were in a simple white jar on a side table. He stood in the hallway of his own estate and felt, for the first time in a long time, like a visitor. "Her Grace is in the working room," the footman said. "I'll let her know." "Thank you," Edmund said. The footman disappeared. Edmund looked at the hallway. The walls had been recently painted a warm pale color. The floor was clean. A coat hung on a peg near the door, a woman's coat, heavy wool. Beside it, a pair of outdoor boots, mud still on them, recently returned from use. This was not how he had thought of this place. He had thought of it as, he was uncomfortable admitting this, somewhere quiet and undemanding, a place to wait. There was nothing about this house that suggested waiting. The footman returned. "Her Grace will see you in a moment. Would you like tea, Your Grace?" "Yes," Edmund said, "thank you." He was shown to a sitting room and left there. He did not sit. He stood at the window and looked at the garden, the kitchen garden at the side of the house, where a late-season planting was still showing green, and beyond it the field and the darkening hills. He was still standing when a leaner came in. He turned. She was not what he expected. He understood immediately that he had been holding in his mind the image of the woman he had last seen getting into a carriage on a cold autumn morning 2 years ago, contained and pale, and keeping her chin up in the way of someone who was furious and not going to show it. He had not updated that image since. He saw now how much it had diverged from what was actually in front of him. She was wearing a practical dress in a dark blue that suited her. Her hair was simply dressed. She looked healthy, not in the polished, maintained way of a woman whose health was her occupation, but in the real way, the way of someone who spent time outdoors and worked with her hands and slept because she was genuinely tired. She looked, in the plain, honest language of observation, well. She looked at him with gray eyes, clear and direct and giving nothing away. "Edmund," she said. He had prepared, in a vague way, for this moment. He had told himself he would not lead with explanation or apology, that those things required ground to be established before they could be useful, and you could not establish ground in a doorway. He had told himself he would simply say something real. "A leaner," he said. That was the entirety of the prepared ground. Everything after it was going to have to be built in the moment. "You'll be tired," she said. "Not warm, not cold, simply factual. There's a room ready for you. Tea is being brought." "Thank you," he said. She moved into the room and sat not in the nearest chair, not at the far end of the room, but at her desk, which was against the wall beside the window. The desk was covered in papers. She had been working before he arrived. She had come to see him, and she was now, clearly and deliberately, sitting at her desk. He took a chair across the room. The tea came. The footman set it down and left. The room was quiet. Alina poured 2 cups. She passed him one across the distance between them. He took it. "Thank you." She settled back in her chair. She looked at him again with that clear, steady look. She was not going to start the conversation. She was going to wait, and she was perfectly comfortable waiting, and Edmund understood that she had become significantly more comfortable with silence than she had been 2 years ago. He had made her that way. He understood this too. "I came to speak to you," he said. He heard how obvious this was and almost winced. "Yes," she said, "I assumed." "There are things I should have said 2 years ago," he said. "A number of them. I will get to all of them if you're willing to let me." She looked at him. Something behind her eyes considered this. "Go on," she said. He told her about Carver. He told her what the investigators had found. He told her what he should have done on the wedding night, asked her, investigated first, treated her as a person whose word had weight rather than a variable in an equation. He told her about George. About the morning he received the letter from Morris about the state of the estate. He told her what he had seen in the hallway when he arrived tonight. He did not manage it without stopping. There were moments when the words ran dry and he had to find them again. She did not help him with this. She listened, but she did not fill in his silences or offer him easier language or make it less difficult than it was. He had not expected her to. He had not wanted her to. When he finished, the tea was cold. The room was quiet. Outside, the more country had gone dark, and the fire in the grate had burned down to a steady, warm glow. Alina looked at the fire for a moment. Then she looked at him. "I know what Carver did," she said. "I investigated it 18 months ago. A solicitor in Durham was very helpful." He absorbed this. "You investigated." "Of course I did," she said. "I had a great deal of time and a very good reason to understand why my husband sent me away on our wedding night." He said nothing. "I'm not saying this to make you feel worse," she added. "I'm saying it because you should know that I am not an unknowing party to this situation. I have not spent 2 years in ignorance. I know what happened. I know what Carver did. And I know what you chose." "Yes," Edmund said. "You chose not to ask me." "Yes. That is the part," she said carefully, "that I am still working with." He waited. "Not the error of judgment," she said. "Not even the decision itself, though neither of those is small. The fact that you looked at me on our wedding night and decided that a letter from a man you had never liked was more credible than the woman standing in front of you." He had no answer to this. He had known before he came that this was the center of it. Everything else was peripheral. This was the thing. "I told you I was innocent," she said. "You heard me, and you sent me anyway." "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire shifted and settled. Somewhere outside, the wind moved across the moors. "You rode 4 days," she said. "3," he said. "I ride fast." Something moved across her face, just for a moment the suggestion of something. "Tea is cold," she said, and stood and pulled the bell cord for the footman. The next morning arrived cold and clear, with that particular northern brightness that had no warmth in it but was generous with light. Edmund woke early in a room he had never slept in before. It was small and clean, and the window looked east, so the first light came in at an angle that fell across the floor in a pale stripe. He lay in the unfamiliar bed for several minutes and listened to the sounds of the house waking around him. Boots on stone floors, voices in a low register, the distant sound of a door, and then the smell of coal smoke as the fires were built up through the house. He dressed without calling for assistance. He had not brought a valet, which Morris had noted with a carefully neutral eyebrow, and went downstairs to find the house already in motion. Breakfast was laid in the small dining room, which was nothing like the dining rooms at Windermere. The table was old wood, unpolished in the formal sense but clean and solid. The curtains were open on a garden that was gray in the early morning. 3 eggs, toast, a pot of strong tea. Eleanor was not there. A note on the table in her handwriting said only, "Walked the North Fields, back by 8." He read this. He sat down and had breakfast. He had brought a book. He had brought it not because he expected to have time for reading, but because Margox had said once that you should always have a book on a journey where the outcome is uncertain, because books are the only company that makes no demands on you. He thought about reading it now and instead sat with the tea and looked at the garden through the window. She had walked the North Fields before breakfast, before 8 in the morning. This was not a woman who slept until noon. He had known she wasn't, from the reports and the accounts and the forward letter. He had understood that she was a person who got up and did things. But there was a difference between understanding something at a distance and sitting at a table where the evidence of it was in the quality of the house around you. He had been wrong about this place in a specific way. He had, without exactly thinking it, imagined Harwick as a waiting room, a place where Eleanor had been put and where she had passed time. He had not imagined her as a person who poured herself into things. He had, and this was uncomfortable to admit, sitting in her dining room in her house eating eggs she had apparently arranged to be very well made. He had imagined a passive version of her, a waiting version. He had been wrong about her from the beginning. He had married a baronet's second daughter and thought he understood what that meant, and he had been wrong in every particular. At 8:10 the front door opened. He heard her voice in the hall saying something to the footman, something about a repair that was being arranged for the following week, that there was a particular kind of stone needed, that she had spoken to the mason and would speak to him again on Thursday. Then her footsteps crossed the hall, and she came into the dining room still wearing her outdoor coat, her boots showing traces of mud, her cheeks sharper in color from the cold. She stopped when she saw him, briefly, in the way of someone who has not forgotten that there is a guest in the house but whose body has momentarily registered surprise anyway. Then she pulled off her coat and set it over the back of a chair, and sat at the table and poured herself tea. "The wall on the north boundary is in good condition," she said, as though they were continuing a conversation. "You'll see it if you walk up that way." "I'd like to," he said. She looked at him. "All right, after I've changed my boots." They walked the north field in the late morning. The ground was firm but cold, and the sky was high and pale, and the repaired wall was exactly what it was. Stone laid carefully and well, new mortar between old stones, the whole thing standing with the solid certainty of proper work. Edmund walked the length of it and said nothing. He was aware of Eleanor walking alongside him at an even pace, not rushing to fill the silence. "When was this done?" he asked. "First spring," she said. "March." He did several calculations. She had arrived in October. By March, 5 months in, she had resolved the tenant dispute and arranged the repair. The tenant farmers on both sides were refusing to contribute, she said, not because he had asked but because she could see him thinking about it. "I told them the cost of the repair was considerably less than the cost of the cattle each of them had lost in the previous season due to straying through the gap. I had the figures. Once they were looking at the figures, the conversation changed. You calculated their losses." It was not difficult. The accounts had records of the complaints about straying stock. I worked backwards. He looked at the wall and thought about the evening they had sat in the working room, him with cold tea and her with the desk between them. He thought about the evenings he had spent in his own study at Windmere, alone, managing by report. He thought about the difference. "I'd like to see the accounts," he said. She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him. "Why?" It was a direct question, and he gave it a direct answer. "Because I want to understand what you've built here, not to audit it or interfere with it. I want to understand it." She held his gaze for a moment, then she resumed walking. "After the midday meal," she said. The midday meal was taken in the same small dining room, and during it Alina was called away twice, once by Mrs. Grant about something in the kitchen, once by the footman relaying a message from Hadley about a boundary marker that had shifted. She dealt with both without irritation, and without making him feel the interruptions were inconvenient. They simply happened, because the house ran on a schedule that was larger than any single conversation. He found this, to his considerable surprise, peaceful. After the meal, she took him to the working room. It was a small room and it was full. The desk was covered in working papers, not messily, but in the dense, organized way of someone who knew where everything was. Along one wall, a set of shelves held ledgers, neatly dated on their spines. The room had 2 chairs and a table by the window, and the smell of books and ink, and a faint trace of something herbal, rosemary perhaps, from the kitchen garden outside the window. There were 3 wildflowers in a cup on the shelf, dried now but still there. She pulled a ledger from the shelf and set it on the desk and opened it. "The accounts start from my first week here," she said. "I found the existing records in a state I'll describe as creative. I spent the first 2 weeks just understanding what the previous arrangement had been." He sat across from her and she walked him through it. She was precise and unemotional. She showed him the starting state and what had changed and why. She showed him the renegotiated supplier contracts and the revised tenant leases and the drainage improvement and its cost and the return on it in terms of the subsequent harvest yield. She had figures for everything. She had notes in the margins that were brief and functional and occasionally dry. A note beside one contract renegotiation that said simply, "He tried to hold to the old rate. I waited. He reconsidered." Edmund read the ledger carefully. He asked 3 questions, and she answered all of them without hesitation. He was not looking at the management of a neglected northern property. He was looking at the work of a remarkably capable person who had been given a problem and had solved it with consistency and intelligence over 2 years. "This is excellent work," he said. He meant it plainly. She received it the same way. "Thank you," she said, without false modesty or performance. "I should have been doing this at Harwick before you arrived," he said. "The previous arrangement was poor." "It was," she agreed, "but I didn't mind having the work to do." She said this without bitterness, which was worse than if she had said it with bitterness, because it meant she genuinely hadn't minded. Not because the situation was fine, but because she had made it workable. He looked at the ledger in his hands. He looked at the room. He looked at the dried flowers on the shelf. "Who brought those?" he asked. She glanced at the shelf, a brief pause. "A friend," she said. He did not ask further. He had a reasonable idea. He had read Dalton's letter 3 times. He understood that there was a man in the county who brought Alina flowers and came on Tuesdays and was careful about the word friend. He set the ledger down on the desk. He was quiet for a moment, finding the right way into what he needed to say. "I'm not here to reclaim something," he said. "I want to be clear about that from the start. I'm not arriving with the assumption that I have a right to anything you've built here or anything you've become." She watched him. Her expression was attentive and guarded and still. "I came because I needed to say things to you in person and because I needed to see this." He gestured at the room, the house, the estate generally, "to understand what I failed to understand at a distance. You are not the person I made a decision about 2 years ago. You were not that person then either, but I did not look carefully enough to see it." She said nothing for a moment. The window light moved across her desk. "What do you want?" she said. "The opportunity to try again," he said. "Not immediately. Not with any particular expectation. I don't deserve an expectation. I want to know whether there is any version of this where you might be willing to let me be in proximity, to prove something over time." She looked at him for a long time. He held still under the look. It was not comfortable. She was not trying to make it comfortable. "I'm not going to give you an answer today," she said. "I didn't expect you to. Or tomorrow. I understand. I need to think," she said. "I need to think about a number of things, and I need you to be here while I think about them because letters are not sufficient for this." He understood what she was saying. She was not giving him permission, but she was not asking him to leave. "How long would you like me to stay?" he asked. She looked out the window at the kitchen garden, at the rosemary and the thyme and the evidence of 2 years of her own work. "I don't know," she said honestly. "We'll see." He nodded. Outside, somewhere on the estate, someone was hammering, a steady, working sound that carried through the walls of the old house. Edmund sat in the working room of his northern estate and listened to the sound of things being built and thought about what it meant to be given a conditional and whether he was capable of holding it carefully enough. He thought he might be. He was not certain. He was here to find out. The days that followed had a structure that was entirely Eleanor's. She rose early. She worked. She walked the estate in the morning before the rest of the house was fully awake, in the manner of a person checking on things she considered her responsibility. She took her meals at the times that suited the household's rhythm. She was not performing this schedule for Edmund's benefit. It was simply how she lived, and it did not pause because he was in the house. Edmund found that he did not mind this. He had expected, arriving at someone else's established life, to feel peripheral. And he did feel peripheral, but not in the way he had feared. He felt it the way you feel peripheral when you sit in a room where someone is deeply absorbed in something they love. The peripheralness was not about being unwanted. It was about not yet being understood. He made himself useful in small ways. He was careful about this. He did not want to impose or to give the impression that he was managing anything. He had no authority here. Eleanor had built this, and it ran on her systems and her relationships and her knowledge of every face and field and arrangement on the property. He understood this clearly. What he could do was simply be present and not be a burden, which required more discipline than it sounded. He helped Hadley with a fence section on the third morning because he had come across the farmer struggling with a section of post that was heavier than one man could manage alone. He said nothing about being the Duke. He simply held the post while Hadley drove it in. They worked for an hour in comfortable silence, and Hadley said at the end of it, "You know your way around a post for a Southerner," and Edmund took this as the compliment it was. He spent afternoons in the library, which was smaller than Windmere's and considerably more organized. Eleanor's additions to it were immediately visible. She had bought or borrowed books on land management, on agricultural practice, on local history, on legal cases involving tenant rights. There were also novels, a good number of them, and poetry, and 3 books on astronomy that suggested a private interest he had not known about. He was looking at one of the astronomy books on the 4th afternoon when Eleanor appeared in the doorway. "Are you busy?" she asked. He set the book down. "No." She came in and sat in the other chair by the fire, and she had a piece of paper in her hand and she looked at it and then at him. "I have a question," she said, "about something that happened before the wedding." He waited. "Your father's dealings with Carver," she said. "The original dispute over the land. How long had it been going on when your father died?" He told her. She listened. She asked 2 more questions, precise, historical, about the specifics of the adjudication, and whether there had been any attempt at resolution after the ruling. He answered as fully as he could. He could see her incorporating the information, the way she processed things visibly, with a seriousness that did not waste energy on anything other than understanding. "I thought so," she said when he finished. "What were you thinking?" That Carver's letter was not an impulsive act, she said. That he had been planning something of that kind for years. That he waited for the right moment, which was a moment when you were new enough in your position and young enough in your marriage that you hadn't yet worked out your own patterns. He was reading you before you had finished becoming yourself. Edmund absorbed this. It was a precise and uncomfortable analysis, and it was, he thought, entirely accurate. "I hadn't framed it that way," he said. "No," she said, "because you were inside it." She stood and put the paper back in her pocket and went to the window and looked out for a moment. Then she turned. "I appreciate that you're being careful about how you're here," she said. "I've noticed that you're not trying to run anything or involve yourself in the estate business." "It's yours," he said simply. "It should be." She looked at him in that assessing way. "Yes," she said, "it should be." A pause. "I'll see you at dinner." She left. He sat in the library and looked at the astronomy book and thought about what it meant to have someone notice carefully. He had not expected her to notice. He had not done it to be noticed. He had done it because it was right. But the fact that she had seen it and named it meant she was watching, and the fact that she was watching meant there was something she was trying to determine. He told himself to be patient. He was not built for patience, but he was built for discipline, and in the absence of patience, discipline would have to serve. On the 6th day, Captain Dalton arrived. Edmund was in the garden with Mrs. Grant. The housekeeper had been explaining the kitchen garden to him at her own initiative, which he understood was a kind of subtle interview, and he was passing it by the simple method of being genuinely interested in what she was saying, when the gate opened and a man on a bay horse came through. He knew, before the man dismounted, who it was, not because he had ever seen him but because of the quality of his arrival, the easy, unhurried confidence of someone who had done this many times and was not questioning his right to be here. Dalton was perhaps 31 or 32, medium height, brown hair, brown eyes, a face that was broad and honestly arranged, the face of a man who did not try to look like anything he wasn't. He wore his coat with the practical neatness of someone who was indifferent to fashion but not to care. He carried a book under his arm. He saw Edmund, and he did not stop or rearrange his expression or perform anything. He kept walking. "Your Grace," he said when he was close enough, and he offered his hand. Edmund took it. The handshake was brief and level. "Captain Dalton," Edmund said. "Yes." Dalton looked at him with a directness that was neither aggressive nor deferential, the look of a man taking stock. "I received your letter a few months ago. I hoped you had. I was glad you wrote, for what that's worth." Dalton turned and went toward the house without further ceremony. Edmund watched him go and understood a number of things at once: that the man was decent, that the decency was not performance, that Alina had, in 2 years, built herself a life that included real people who cared about her and showed it without complication, and that however Edmund felt about any of this, it was not something he could object to or resent without being a much worse man than he intended to be. He followed Dalton inside. Alina received Dalton in the sitting room with a warmth that was natural and genuine, and she received Edmund's presence in the same room with a careful watchfulness, and the three of them had tea in an arrangement that was not hostile but was very clearly complex. Dalton asked Edmund about the ride from Windermere. He was polite and he was not making small talk. He was genuinely curious about the roads, because he knew the route and had opinions about the section north of York. They discussed this for a few minutes with the neutral ease of two people who have nothing comfortable to discuss, but have found one thing that serves. Then Dalton turned to Alina and asked about the mason and the repair that was being arranged, and Alina told him, and there was a brief, fluent conversation between them that moved through several subjects with the rhythm of two people who know each other's shorthand. Not intimate in any way that was inappropriate. Simply close, in the honest way of people who have spent real time together. Edmund watched this and held himself still. He had read Dalton's letter. He had read the careful word friend. He had believed it when he read it, and he believed it now, seeing them together. The warmth was real and the boundary was real, and the boundary was not Edmund's doing. Alina was holding it. When Dalton left an hour later, with a politeness toward Edmund that was genuine and not performed, Alina walked him to the gate. Edmund stayed in the sitting room. He could see them from the window, not because he was watching for anything, but because the window looked onto the lane and they were standing near the gate. Dalton said something. Alina laughed, a real laugh, the one that changed the line of her face. Then she said something and Dalton shook his head and put the book he had brought down into her hands and got on his horse and rode off. She stood at the gate for a moment after he had gone. Then she came back inside. She came into the sitting room still holding the book. She set it on the table and looked at Edmund. "He knows you're here," she said. "Yes," Edmund said. "He's known for several days. I told him." Edmund waited. He said. She paused, and something moved across her face that he could not read. He said that if you had ridden 4 days to come north, you were at minimum serious, and that I should give you the time to prove whether the seriousness was real. Edmund said nothing. He said this, she added, as my friend, not as someone with an interest in the outcome. She looked at the book on the table. He is very decent. Yes, Edmund said, he is. She looked at him. Does that bother you? The fact that he's decent. The fact that he has been here, she said, for 2 years, that I have people. That I am not what I was when you left me at the gate. Edmund looked at her and answered the real question underneath the one she had asked. It does not bother me that you have built a life. If it did, I would not deserve to be here. She held the look for a moment. Then she picked up the book. Dinner is at 7, she said. Mrs. Grant has a way with braised beef that is well worth being present for. She left the room. Edmund stayed where he was for a few minutes, looking at the empty doorway. He thought about what she had asked. Does that bother you, the directness of it, the precision? She had not asked it to wound him, she had asked it because she needed to know. She was gathering information. She was still deciding. He had an answer, and he had given it, and it had been the honest one, which was the only kind that was going to work. He went to find his coat. He thought he would walk the south boundary before dinner. He had not seen it yet, and there was light enough. He had the slow, careful feeling of a man who had arrived at a place that was going to require more from him than he had previously given anything, and who had decided that this was exactly as it should be. The conversation they had been working toward happened on the 8th evening. It did not happen by arrangement. It was not planned. It happened the way the most important conversations happen, by arriving at the moment when the things unsaid become heavier than the cost of saying them. Alina had been quiet at dinner. Not unhappily quiet. She had spoken to Mrs. Grant about the following week's provisions, and to the footman about a letter that needed sending. But she had been internal in a way that Edmund had begun to recognize. She was thinking about something, and had not yet decided what to do with it. After dinner she went to the sitting room and sat by the fire. Edmund came in and sat across from her. He had a glass of port, and he did not offer her one because she had made it clear in a dozen small ways that she preferred to manage her own comfort. He sat. He did not try to start anything. Outside, the wind was moving. It was that particular northern wind that did not shout but pressed steadily and continuously against the house, the kind of wind that makes you aware of walls. The fire was good. The room was warm. "Tell me about George," she said. He had not expected this to be the opening, and he took a moment with it. "What would you like to know?" "What he was like," she said. "You mentioned him when you arrived. You mentioned losing him, but I didn't know him. I sat near him at the wedding breakfast and he smiled at me twice. That was the whole of our acquaintance." Edmund set his glass down. He thought about how to describe George without making it a performance of grief, which it was not. It was simply the honest description of a person. He was younger and lighter than me in almost every way, he said. He found things funny, not cruelly. He had the quality of seeing the absurdity in situations without needing it to be at anyone's expense. I found it. I found it both admirable and slightly difficult to understand because I don't have that. I tend to see the weight of things first. I noticed, she said. He nodded. He would have gotten on well with you, he said. I think he saw that at the wedding. He looked at me afterward with a look that meant he thought I was lucky and should be aware of it. He paused. I was not, at the time, appropriately aware of it. She looked at the fire. Was it quick at the end? The fever took him in 4 days, Edmund said. He was in London and I was at Windermere. By the time I arrived, the worst of it was, there was very little I could do except be there. He stopped. The stopping was involuntary. He picked up his glass and set it down again without drinking from it. I am sorry, Elinor said. She said it simply without decorating it. Thank you, he said. They were quiet for a moment. The fire settled. I thought, he said, and then stopped and started again. I thought, when Carver's letter came, that I was being rational. I thought I was protecting something. George, the estate, the family. I had been trained my entire life to think first about what needed protecting and then act. It was not an unreasonable way to live for most purposes. But you applied it to a marriage, she said. Yes. Which is not most purposes. No, he said, it is not. She turned from the fire and looked at him. The firelight was on the side of her face and she was very still. Here is what I have been sitting with, she said. For the last 8 days, I want to tell you what it is. Please, he said. I'm not angry with you, she said. I was for a long time. I was angry in the carriage. I was angry in the first months here. I was angry in the particular way you are angry when someone has taken something from you that they had no right to take, which was my beginning. Our beginning, whatever we might have been. She paused. That anger went away, not because I forgave it, not then, but because I had other things to do and anger is expensive and I didn't have the budget for it. Edmund said nothing. What remained, she said, after the anger went was this. I understood what had happened. I understood Carver and I understood your logic and I understood that you had been afraid, which is not something I think you have often admitted to yourself, because you don't look like a man who is often afraid. I was afraid, he said. I know, she said. I could see it, even on the night itself. You were afraid and you handled it the way you handle everything, by making a decision and acting on it and making the decision look like certainty. She looked at the fire briefly. The problem was that the decision required me to be guilty for the certainty to hold, and so I was. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. I don't want to spend the rest of my life managing my life around a wrong that was done to me, she said. I've discovered over 2 years that I'm very good at building things. I've built something here. It's mine and I'm proud of it. But she stopped. He waited. But I said vows, she said. In that chapel, in the rain, I meant them. Not because I was told to mean them and not because I was in love with you. We barely knew each other. There was nothing yet to be in love with. I meant them because I decided to. Because I had looked at you and thought there was something real in there and I was willing to commit to finding out what it was. Edmund was very still. I still want to know, she said, what that real thing is. He heard this. He let it sit for a moment. There are things I should tell you about myself, he said. Things that I should have told you before the wedding and didn't, because I was more interested in managing the arrangement than in being known by you. Yes, she said, I expect there are. I'm not easy to be close to, he said. I'm aware of this. I've been told it in various ways my whole life. I think first. I feel later and usually privately. I'm better in a crisis than in an ordinary Wednesday, which is the wrong way around for a marriage. I work too much and I don't explain myself when I should, and I have a habit of deciding things without asking the person they most concern. I'm aware of several of those things, she said without heat. I know, he said. I'm telling you them not as excuses. I'm telling you because I want you to know what you're working with if you choose to. A pause. I am also, he stopped, found it. I am also capable, I think, of more than I have demonstrated. I believe this is true. I have not had the right conditions for it. She looked at him. What are the right conditions? He looked back at her. Being treated like a person who can do better, he said, rather than like a fact of life that must be managed around. Something changed in her face. Not a smile, nothing so resolved as that, but a shift, a small opening. I manage a great many things, she said. I'm not sure I want to manage a husband. No, he said, I shouldn't think so. The fire had burned down somewhat. The wind pressed against the house. I'm going to ask you something, she said. I want an honest answer. Yes. If I said that I wanted to try, that I wanted to see if there was something here worth building, would you stay? Not in Northumberland permanently. I mean in the situation, in the difficulty of it. Would you stay through the parts where it is not simple? Edmund looked at her without hesitation. Yes, he said. That is the exact thing I came 4 days to say. She looked at him for a long, serious moment. All right, she said, not warmly, not coldly, with the seriousness of a person who is making an agreement they intend to keep. All right, he said back. Outside. The wind moved and the moor was dark, and the house sat in the middle of it like something that had decided to hold. There's a second pot of tea somewhere, Eleanor said, if you'd like some. He would like some, he said so. She went to find it. He sat by the fire and looked at it and felt, for the first time in 2 years, something that did not have a clean name but was closest to the feeling of a door being opened. Not thrown open, not flung wide, just opened, the width of a first try. He thought that was exactly right. There was a particular quality to the days after that evening, a quality that Eleanor found difficult to name precisely but which she recognized. It was the quality of things that were moving but had not yet arrived. A ship that has changed course but has not yet reached the harbor. A season between winter and spring, when the ground is still cold but you can feel in the angle of the light that something is about to shift. She went about her work and Edmund went about his slow and careful becoming acquainted with the estate, and they met at meals and in the library and occasionally in the garden, and the conversations they had were different from the conversations they had been having in the first week. Less careful, less arranged, more like two people who had agreed to stop managing what they said and were now discovering what they actually said when they stopped. He asked her about the astronomy bow.